Spies, scandal, and sabotage, these period dramas have it all. From an ex-dressmaker decoding Nazi messages in her stitching to a penniless woman scheming her way into high society, these are the 8 most underrated PBS masterpiece dramas you've never seen. When people talk about British period dramas, they always go straight to Pride and Prejudice, the Colin Firth one, obviously. Maybe Brideshead Revisited if they're feeling fancy. But somehow, no one ever brings up the Duchess of Duke Street, and honestly, that's a crime. This show is a gem. It follows Louisa Trotter, a working-class woman in Victorian and Edwardian England who climbs her way up from nothing to become a legendary chef and hotel owner. And this isn't some soft, romanticized, rags-to-riches story. She's tough, she's ambitious, and she absolutely earns her place among London's elite. The show is loosely based on the real-life Rosa Lewis, who ran the Cavendish Hotel and was famous for cooking for the king. And what's wild is that when this show aired, plenty of people still remembered her. She only passed away in 1952. Gemma Jones absolutely owns this role. For a certain generation of viewers, she is Louisa Trotter. You just believe every second of her performance, from her early struggles to her rise as one of the most powerful women in London's hotel scene. Back in the 70s, PBS was basically a royal court for British period dramas, and The Duchess of Duke Street was one of the best they ever aired. If you love shows like Upstairs, Downstairs, or Poldark, this one's a must-watch. Set in 1795 India, Beecham House follows John Beecham, a former soldier with the East India Company who's trying to start a new life in Delhi. He buys a house, settles in, and of course, ends up caught between British colonial interests and local power struggles. Think of it as Downton Abbey in Delhi. And that's exactly how it was marketed. Critics were mixed. Some wanted something more radical. But for fans of melodramatic, lavish period soaps, this absolutely delivered. And the historical accuracy is way better than people give it credit for. The costuming, the cultural clashes, the casting, it gets the complexity of British Indian history in a way that most period dramas wouldn't even attempt. Plus, if you actually watch Bollywood, you'll notice some huge stars in the cast. And the dialogue is way more sarcastic and sharp than you'd expect. But none of that mattered in the end, because Beecham House got left on a cliffhanger, and ITV pulled the plug anyway. This BBC miniseries takes Thomas Hardy's 1891 novel and gives it a fresh but faithful take. Gemma Arterton plays Tess, with a very young Eddie Redmayne as Angel Clare. And fun fact, this was actually BBC's first time adapting Tess for TV. Took them long enough. David Nichols, who wrote the adaptation, was obsessed with getting Tess right. He wanted to make her more than just a tragic victim. He wanted to show her as strong, opinionated, and active in her own fate. And the result is something that feels both romantic and brutally realistic. This adaptation doesn't shy away from how hard life was for working-class women in Victorian England, and the emotional weight of it all is exactly what makes it so powerful. The acting is fantastic, and the period detail is top-notch. And if this had been a theatrical film, Arterton should have been in the Oscar conversation. Set during World War II and the post-war years, this Australian miniseries follows Jean, an English woman who survives being marched through Malaya as a prisoner of the Japanese. While in captivity, she meets Joe Harmon, an Australian soldier, and what follows is a love story and a survival story that stretches across continents and decades. The whole thing is based on a true story, and it does not shy away from how brutal things really were. The Japanese had no idea what to do with a group of captured English women, so they literally marched them around for 3 years. Most of them didn't survive. Helen Morse plays Jean, and she's perfect in the role. Tough, intelligent, and constantly pushing back against authority. And Brian Brown as Joe is peak rugged Australian energy. The chemistry between them is just ridiculous. It was a hit when it aired, got an Emmy nomination, and yet somehow it never gets talked about today. If you love period dramas and great war stories, A Town Like Alice deserves a spot on your watch list. Ace of Spies follows Sidney Reilly, a real-life master spy who operated before and during the Russian Revolution. The show covers his career from the late 19th century through the 1920s, and it is hands down one of the best espionage dramas ever made. This was a breakout role for Sam Neill, and he is perfect as Reilly. He plays him as tough, cunning, and completely unreadable. Exactly what you'd expect from a guy who pulled off some of the wildest spy missions in history. Director Martin Campbell later went on to direct GoldenEye and Casino Royale, which makes so much sense because Reilly feels way more like an actual spy story than most Bond movies, and the historical detail is unreal. The sets, the costumes, the way they recreate early 20th century politics, it all feels authentic. And what's really impressive is how much real history they managed to pack into it without ever making it feel dry or overly expository. Set in 1803, this mini-series picks up 6 years after Pride and Prejudice, with Elizabeth and Darcy now happily married, until, of course, a dead body turns up and ruins their fancy ball. It's based on the book by P.D. James, which takes Austen's characters and throws them into a full-blown whodunit. Now, I'll be honest, this one got trashed when it came out. People hated how Darcy was written, thought Elizabeth was too dull, and were not happy about the costume choices. Apparently, the costume department decided Lizzie Bennet only needed, like, 2 dresses. But despite all that, there's something oddly watchable about it. The cast is stacked: Matthew Rhys, Anna Maxwell Martin, Matthew Goode, Jenna Coleman, and the setting is gorgeous. Plus, if you're a sucker for period dramas, once you start, you kind of have to see it through. Is it great? No. But is it a fun, slightly messy, murder-filled period piece? Absolutely. If you want a period drama that'll pull you in fast, Home Fires is it. Set in World War II, it follows a group of women in a small English village as they hold everything together while the men are off fighting. And it's so good. Authentic sets, great performances, a perfect mix of heartwarming and heartbreaking moments. It was doing really well in the ratings too. But then, in 2016, ITV randomly decided to cancel it after 2 seasons. Fans were furious. There were petitions, campaigns, people begging for it to continue. But ITV wasn't having it. Luckily, the story did get finished. Just not on TV. The screenwriter wrapped everything up in a book series. So if you're dying to know how it ends, you'll have to track those down. Still, even unfinished, Home Fires is an underrated gem that's absolutely worth watching. Bleak House is a masterpiece of Victorian drama. The whole thing revolves around this never-ending legal case, Jarndyce and Jarndyce, and it shows how it destroys the lives of everyone caught up in it. It's a brutal takedown of the 19th century legal system, and it hits hard. The BBC's 2005 version nails the atmosphere, dark, suspenseful, and honestly kind of perfect for a cold, rainy night. Gillian Anderson is amazing. Carey Mulligan pops up in one of her early roles, and Charles Dance is unforgettable as Josiah Tulkinghorn, a villain so vile even Dance himself called him one of Dickens's worst. And that's saying something, considering how many despicable characters Dickens created. Dance is so good at being despicable that it got him cast as Tywin Lannister in Game of Thrones.